Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Ask Professor Paranormal. And hope everybody's February is going well. You had a nice Valentine's Day, and that you might have some questions for me tonight. I see a couple of my students, Patrick and Patrick's in here. Paul, who is a regular, thank you for coming, Paul. And I will just address that first thing from Ban Everything. Never heard of anything like that. Ban everything outside of science fiction shows and some horror movies. I'm afraid that's not something that has ever popped up in our literature at all. So I couldn't even tell you what to make of it, especially since it was so long ago. Can't even ask you appropriate questions about it. Mrs. Niz, good to see you here. Thank you for coming. Anyway, as I think some of you who were regulars would know, this is a good time for the next hour to ask me questions, to raise topics related to parapsychology, psychic phenomena, the paranormal, as much as I can address things outside of psychic phenomena, which, by the way, does include apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists. I hope that you can come up with something. And Patrick, the session that I did with John Kruth yesterday, for those you don't know, this is the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Duke Parapsychology Lab, which exists today off campus as the Rhine Research Center. And yesterday, John Kruth, who's the executive director, I'm president of the board of directors, we did a kind of a discussion and look back at some of the people involved, the founding of the Duke Parapsychology Lab. And John and I also talked about how we each came to the field and how it connects, how our stories connect to J.B. Rhine and Louisa Rhine, the founders of that lab, and also how we got to the Rhine itself. So we had, I learned something about John. I think he learned something about me, and we went for almost 2 hours yesterday. It was a very good kind of discussion that we actually had. It was recorded. I do not know when it will be up on the Rhine website, but I suspect it'll be sooner. We're still having some issues with some of our video, the software that's been kind of forwarding the video into the website. So we'll see, but that'll be coming up soon. I'll also mention that the Rhine, this is the 90th anniversary, and there'll be a monthly lecture that'll be available on the web. So that's important to know. The other is that there are some other lectures coming up that are in the events center. So if you go to rhine.org, and there's going to be kind of a carousel with some new events coming up, but you can also go to the events page and take a look at what's coming up. All of the events are, unless they are specifically stated as only being on site, but all the lectures, panels, things like that over the next year will be recorded, but they'll also be on Zoom so people can attend. They are basically free, although we do, because the Rhine Center is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, we do ask for a donation if people are willing to give it. But, you know, that could be nothing, but we hope people do something. Okay. Edgar, did you ever meet Scott Rogo before his murder? Oh, yeah. Scott Rogo, I knew, interesting enough, I met Scott first when he was teaching a couple of classes for us at JFK University up here in Northern California. That's when I was a graduate student. So that was, I probably met him in 1980, I think was the first time we had him come up. And got to know him fairly well at that point, and also my first Parapsychological Association convention. I spent a lot of time talking to him. When I went back to JFK as a faculty member, we brought Scott in again, so I got to talk to him quite a bit. And I did talk to him every so often because he was a really good resource for me. In some respects, I consider his background and what we talked about is kind of mentoring me to some, not directly mentoring, but I felt like that. Scott had written a slew of books, many of which have been reprinted, by the way. And if you go to Amazon and put in D. Scott Rogo, any of his books, I will say, are worth picking up. Any of them, whether they have to do with Phone Calls from the Dead, which is going to be reprinted, if it's not already reprinted, or if it has to do with apparitions, you know, hauntings. He's written books on just about every aspect of parapsychology. He was trained in musicology, so there's even a book on kind of musical phenomena related to the paranormal as well that's out there. So definitely something worth reading. And since you're reading Phone Calls from the Dead, you might want to pick up Cal Cooper's book. So it's Callum Cooper. He has a book called Telephone Calls from the Dead. He picked up where Phone Calls from the Dead left off decades ago. And Cal is actually going to be working on, from what I understand, a biography of Scott. Scott was a really kind of, in many respects, he was the person we could call to find out when something was written in the literature of our field going back 100 years. He knew everything and that. He could kind of call it at his fingertips. So, yeah, definitely a good guy. Really interesting in many respects. Okay, and for those of you wondering about the murder thing, yeah, he was murdered in 1990, and they finally caught someone. There's some indication that a psychic was involved in helping to catch the guy, but it was a real sad thing for the field that he was gone. We've lost a lot of people over the years, usually not to murder, sometimes to accidents or just simply old age. And fortunately, there are newer people coming into the field of parapsychology. It's a field that, like a lot of fields, we want people to come in. Unfortunately, there's not necessarily a career path in parapsychology like there might be in a number of other fields. Phone Calls from the Dead is really interesting. And the Telephone Calls from the Dead, Cal's book, is really interesting. There are other examples of what's been called instrumental transcommunication, because that falls under those categories. And even a few years ago, one of my OPI, the Office of Paranormal Investigations folks, was contacted, and we kind of talked to this guy and saw his evidence. It was really interesting. He got a video email from his brother who had passed away like a couple weeks before. He got this thing which didn't show his brother, but had his brother's voice and showed an indication of what day it was. And now, granted, that could have been edited together and, basically, faked for us, but he seemed really sincere, and he certainly didn't do anything with it other than asking us what we thought about it. He also did check with the phone carrier to make sure that this wasn't simply a delayed voicemail of some kind. So we do hear about those kinds of things. And along those lines, besides the phone calls, and the phone calls often are answering machine messages, these days voicemail messages. There have been emails. Unfortunately, emails can sometimes get delayed. I know that I've sent an email to somebody and it got into their box 2 weeks later, which was very weird. But those kinds of things can happen as well. But there are definitely some really good examples of somebody picking up the phone, and there is the voice of a deceased loved one who's on the other end, basically providing a message, saying goodbye, that kind of thing. So it's just not even a voicemail, just kind of a seemingly live phone call, which is interesting. So that's a whole area in and of itself. I will be talking a bit more about that and other forms of electronic voice phenomena and instrumental transcommunication in an upcoming class that we're offering at the Rhine Education Center, which I think most of you who come previously have heard me talk about the Rhine. So the Rhine Research Center has an education arm. You can get to it very simply by going to rhine.org and clicking on the education link, or go to rhineedu.org. And you'll see that there are a couple of upcoming 4-week classes starting in March. And I'll be teaching one on technology in relation to the paranormal. So I'll be talking, among other things, about video, photography, instrumental transcommunication, which is more than just EVP, but electronic voice phenomena. So audio stuff, video stuff, other kinds of communication as well that involves technology. Yeah, Paul, I did see White Noise. I'm afraid I did not like it, mainly because I thought the writing was crappy and the ending didn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't think it was a well-written movie. I do know that some of the promos, they did have Tom and Lisa Butler talking about actual EVP, which was good. But I can't say I really enjoyed that film. It was getting good, and then it just simply fell flat towards the end. Totally fell flat, which is really too bad. And, the only reason it was called white noise is because some people doing EVP actually will use white noise static and try to pick voices out of the static, which is really not a great way to do anything, because we as human beings are programmed, we're made to find patterns. And so people will hear things in regular white noise without any intention of communicating with spirits. They'll hear stuff there that sounds like something, kind of like looking at a cloud and saying it looks like a dragon, that kind of thing. So that's for those of you in the know, it's called pareidolia. Yeah, the ending of that movie, it just was lazy writing and bad writing is what I thought on that, which is too bad. Any of those movies that talk about a real phenomena, even though they might exaggerate it for science fiction or horror, I prefer the science fiction end, they could do a lot better with getting information out. Yeah, they should have been done in white noise. Pick up the voice of Beetlejuice. That would have been pretty funny. I think that would have been maybe that's a good way to remake the movie or to do a new version. There were two movies that were released pretty close to each other, and the same company was involved in packaging the DVD or Blu-ray. So that company contacted me, also contacted others, including a couple of mediums and some other folks. One movie was The Hereafter, or just simply Hereafter. That was a Clint Eastwood directed film, which had Matt Damon playing a medium that actually had a portrayal of a medium, an apparition situation, and a near-death experience. And the extras on the Blu-ray actually have really good information about the actual phenomena. The interview was really, they did a really good interview. Actually, I thought it was one of the better interviews that I've done for any sort of TV or anybody else, because the editing, they didn't have to edit for television. They were editing it for information, more or less. And the other one was called Charlie St. Cloud, which was based on a YA novel. It had Zac Efron in it. And it, too, portrayed phenomena in a fairly realistic basis. In some respects, more realistic than Hereafter. It had a crisis apparition and an apparition of the dead. And it was a really good film. Again, there's a great extra on the DVD that has myself and others in it that really look at the phenomena of apparitions and life after death. I think both of them were very good movies. The only thing I didn't like really about Hereafter was the portrayal of Matt Damon as a medium. The only way he could connect with spirit for someone was to touch them. It's kind of something like the TV show The Dead Zone. And that's not how mediums work. Mediums don't connect with spirit by actually touching the person whose relative or friend it happens to be. They don't need to do that. It's not part and parcel of what most psychics do, in fact. So that was really the only piece that I didn't really take to very well. But otherwise, I thought the portrayal of the mediumship and the apparition and the near-death experience, even though it was connected to a horrible tragedy, the tsunami that hit Sri Lanka, all really interesting, and how the three characters came together was well written, very well written in that sense. So definitely a movie. If you haven't seen that movie and you haven't seen Charlie St. Cloud, I do recommend both films. And I know that some streaming services sometimes have the extras, but one of the problems with streaming services is you don't get the extras most of the time. I buy physical media, partly because you never know when a movie is going to disappear from a streaming service, and partly because I want to see the extras too. And I don't even really care so much about the commentaries. It's more the additional things, including deleted scenes. And sometimes if it's a movie like The Hereafter, great documentaries that are included with that. There have been others that I've worked with on that. Hi, Kathy. Welcome. One I've never seen. Actually, I did an interview at the Queen Mary, the haunted Queen Mary down in Long Beach, for the European release of a horror film called Ghost Ship. I've seen the movie, but I have not seen um, the extras. The extras were only apparently going to be on the European UK release of the movie, not on that DVD, not on the US one, which I thought was kind of weird, but it's too bad that happened. All right, Indie Stalker, talk about my dream research. Well, I mean, my dream research was really um, in line with doing my book, Psychic Dreaming. And that goes back quite a ways, actually. So the research I did on that book, besides really researching more about dreams in general, because I was not as well versed in dreams, in terms of what goes on in the brain, what goes on psychologically, the sleep cycles, things like that. I knew a bit, but I knew a lot more by the time I finished doing that research. But also, when my first book came out, ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists in the mid 80s, I had a survey in the back of that book. And the intention was, had our parapsychology program continued at JFK University, we were going to have students, the grad students, actually deal with the data from the surveys and crunch the numbers and give us some good data on people's experiences. So along with the survey, which was, a yes, no, multiple choice, we'll kind of fill in the blank, people sent in their experiences. And a lot of people, because one of the questions was about psychic dreams, a lot of people sent in their psychic dream experiences, some of which were not really psychic, but many of which actually were. So I went through all of those experiences and often actually contacted the people who had acknowledged that I could contact them from the survey and from what they sent in, and just got permission to use some of this material in the book. But finding interesting patterns and really good examples of what people thought were unusual dreams that came true, or that connected with reality in some way. People had out-of-body dreams, a lot of precognitive dreams, some really interesting ones as well that came through. And as part of this also, I spent time speaking with Montague Ullman, who was a parapsychologist and a psychiatrist, who was one of the two principals doing research on dream telepathy at Maimonides Medical Center in the 1970s. He and Stan Krippner published a book, which I think last year or the year before came out as a 50th anniversary edition. You can definitely find it on Amazon, called Dream Telepathy, about the actual research that they did at Maimonides. So I spent time talking to Stan, to Monty Ullman. I spoke to Stan Krippner a little bit. Stan had written some books on the subject as well. I talked to a couple of other folks who were involved in dream studies related to psychic phenomena, but I never really did any laboratory work with dream studies like that. Since then, I have been contacted by people and spent time kind of gathering information from people about their psychic dreams. So that's really what I've been doing over the years for any of the topics I deal with. The movie Entity, which is it's based on a novel by Frank DiFilippo, who based the novel on an actual case that the UCLA parapsychology folks had, Kerry Gaynor and Barry Taff, Barry's name may be familiar to folks. And this was an actual poltergeist case. The book came out and the movie came out while I was working at the American Society for Psychical Research. And through Kerry Gaynor, who I knew pretty well at the time, I was able to speak to Frank DiFilippo, because I wanted to talk to him before. I think I talked to him before the movie came out. But he talked to me about how for the novel, certain things were exaggerated. I mean, the sexual content, the sexual focus, the ghost raping the woman in that movie is from the novel, not from the actual case. There was some physical activity on the woman in the actual case, but it was not that kind of activity for the most part in the case. He played up a lot of different things in this book. And he had also, DiFilippo had talked to both Kerry and Barry, gotten their report on it. He had spoken to the person running the parapsychology group at UCLA, Thelma Moss, and got her take on some things as well. And the movie kind of played up the kind of like spectacular, the stuff that would catch people's attention. And sitting watching the movie, I hadn't really talked too much to Carrie about the actual case at that time. I didn't know Barry at that point. But I knew what was not going to be true from having read the novel, of course, and talking to Frank DiFelita. We get to the end. For those who haven't seen The Entity, one of the things that happens is there's an assumption in the movie that there's actually an entity, not like a ghost that is responsible for all the attacks. That is not where the actual investigation went. That's not how the investigation went. To them, it was what we consider recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, that it came from the woman herself. So in the movie, there's an entity, and someone suggests in the movie that they try to capture the entity. And the final part of the film, which takes place in this university, I think the university was unnamed. I don't think they called it UCLA, but they took over a gymnasium in the athletic facility at this university, and they built a replica of the woman's house, like a set, in there, put her in there in hopes of having the entity attack her there, and they were going to freeze it. I think it was liquid helium or something like that. This was an offhanded suggestion of apparently of Thelma Moss's. It was not a really serious suggestion, but they did it in the film. And people, because it was played up as based on a true story, the calls that came in, because I was in the education department at the ASPR, from reporters and other people were bizarre. Because this is the problem with saying that a movie is based on a true story. People think everything in that movie is true. Well, they never did that experiment, and UCLA never would have let them take over a gym, build a set in an athletic facility, and take a chance at destroying the gym with liquid helium spraying around, not to mention the potential liability because the woman was there at the time. That would never happen in any university, especially any university with an athletic program. My dad at that time was producing the international broadcast of the Rose Bowl as well as the Rose Parade. And I'd been around university athletics, not a sports fan myself, but because of my father, talked to Pac-10 cultures and been around that sort of thing. Most of the money that comes in from alumni to support a major university often comes from the athletic programs. And the idea of potentially destroying a gymnasium was the most, forget about the ghost part. That was the unbelievable thing for me. That was totally unbelievable. And people were asking, did they do that at the real university? It's like, that's the most bizarre thing of all things. As a side note, I just want to mention that UCLA for the last probably 10 years or more has been denying there ever was parapsychology at UCLA. And considering the fact that CBS interviewed people on site at the lab in the 70s, and reporters wrote articles about the lab, and the people working there in the 70s, and even the UCLA paper and magazine did stuff there. It's very interesting that UCLA denies that it ever was on campus, even in the face of all the actual evidence, physical evidence that's there. It just shows the academic prejudice that's out there. I don't think much about Ed and Lorraine Warren at all. They were opportunists who claimed that they never charged anybody, yet they always asked for a fee for expenses, or at least in many of their cases. I know of 3 cases specifically where $5,000 was asked for. In one case, I had advised the folks, to ask for, because this is up front, before the Warrens would come out to this case in Michigan, they wanted $5,000 guaranteed for their expenses. And it wasn't like, this was back in the 80s. It wasn't going to cost them $5,000 to fly there. They would have had to fly first class. They would have had to buy tickets the day before. They would have had to rent a limo with a driver. It was absurd that it was going to cost that much. And so I said, just ask for, for some kind of breakdown. Why is it so much for expenses? What are your expenses going to be? And then in another case, the Warrens were in the case. This is in Southern California, and they hit folks with, we had expenses. It's $5,000. We want to get our expenses back. It was $5,000. There was actually a writer, a journalist who was writing about the case. And he was staying with the family, and I advised him to ask them for the family to ask for an accounting, an invoice with all the expenses, and they could say it's for our taxes. And when they mentioned that to the Warrens got really angry and left in a huff. And then there was the situation with the case in Pennsylvania, the poltergeist case that they said that Ed Warren said was demonic. It was actually made into a movie at one point. Can't recall the name of the family. But there was a press conference that Ed Warren called, and I actually talked to reporters about this. This was, again, when I was working at the ASPR. And Warren claimed, calling the press conference, that he had video of the demon in the case, and that he was going to show that he could show it. So press conference comes, reporters are there from a lot of papers, a lot of news outlets, and Ed Warren is talking about it, and somebody says, "Hey, you're going to show the video?" And he stops and he says, "Well, I really can't because I sent the videotape to the Vatican for analysis." At which point, from what one of the reporters I spoke to said, he and many others got up and left. Stuff like that were stuff that the Warrens were doing. In addition, I know of at least one case that I talked to the folks about, and I also spoke to a psychotherapist in Connecticut in the early 80s. I've talked to people since then, by the way, too. But I talked to one psychotherapist in the early 80s where there was a normal explanation or explanations for several cases that the Warrens never looked for. And in fact, the people were more freaked out after the Warrens were there. And then it turned out there were normal explanations. So didn't think much of that. They also exaggerated the whole Amityville situation. They were not parapsychologists. They were not trained in our field. A lot of issues come up with that sort of thing, with what they did. Okay. The email. All right. So where to ask questions. So I'm going to put this in here. So it's just simply ask profparanormal@gmail.com, or you can also do it to prof without the ask, just profparanormal@gmail.com. So you can send stuff for that as well. That's fine. Have I seen the movie Chiller? I don't know that movie. And there have been plenty of movies with the word chiller as the title. So I don't really know. Sorry about that. Are there shifts happening in the universe, seeing many plane accidents happening back to back? Yeah. Politics. Issues going on with the FAA, with the air traffic controllers. It's not the universe. It's coming from one source. That's what I'm going to say. I don't want to get into a political discussion, but we're in trouble. I'll just say that. Okay. The other thing also is what Boeing did. So it's not just politics. There's also corporate greed that certainly happened with the Boeing situation. And I'm afraid that we don't have enough manufacturing oversight in some areas of transportation and other areas. That's just around the world. It's not just here. Corporations are taking advantage of. They're taking shortcuts. This has always been the case. After the earthquake here in 1989 in the Bay Area, we had a partial collapse of the Bay Bridge, and that was because of the way the bridge was structured, which they then fixed. There was also a fire in the Marina District of San Francisco. This is what you would see on TV if you were not in the Bay Area. And that was because of a gas explosion that happened because of the earthquake. And then the double-decker, what was called the Cypress structure on the highway going through Oakland collapsed. And that's where 250 people died. So there was an investigation looking at the structure and why did that fail? It was built in the 50s. It was supposed to be built to specifications to handle an earthquake. Not that you can really consider all possibilities depending on how the earthquake actually hits or how strong it is. So one of the local TV stations tracked down the actual engineer who designed the cypress structure. And he had the original plans. And he brought the plans to the TV station, and they were going over the plans and also an analysis of the actual supports on the cypress structure. And apparently, the supports were not built to his specifications, which had kind of almost a spiral string structure of steel in there to absorb a lot of the vibration. They weren't built that way. They were built on the cheap. So someone in the 50s decided, we can spend less money on this. We don't need to build it as, spend all that money and build it this way. It'll hold up, that kind of thing. We didn't have the oversights that we have today, the regulations that we have. People hate regulations, I know, but regulations keep us safe in general. It's why buildings in downtown San Francisco didn't collapse during the earthquake, because they were all on rollers. They may go for a long time, but I know the building I was working in at the time, I wasn't around that day. I was in New York at the time. But the building I was in, which was 101 California, that building, my understanding is the only thing people lost or the only damage internally in the building were mugs that fell off people's desks and broke, and some filing cabinets, the drawers, if they were not locked, they opened up and the filing cabinet fell over. That was it, pretty much. So we have a lot of earthquake regulations in California now, and that's why so much still stays standing. It's ridiculous that, and this is kind of going outside the field, but this happens in a lot of fields of science also, where people take shortcuts because they want to have certain results to get their funding as well. Okay. So my email should be in the description of the channel. It's not in the video description, but it is in the description of the channel. That should be there, but I'll make sure it's there again. Just double check for that. Thoughts on Nostradamus? Not very accurate at all. Subject to interpretation. And I have to wonder if Michel de Nostradam actually had the intention to write these quatrains, or four-line poems almost, in a way that people would be interpreting differently down the road. The only two dates that even occurred within any of the predictions was 1999 and I think 68 something. So the end of the world in the year 68, or towards the sixth millennium, that millennium. 1999 came and went, but people previously, prior to that, were interpreting that quatrain as a nuclear war. Afterwards, people realized, no, it wasn't a nuclear war. It was fireworks all over the world for the change into the year 2000. There are older books. If you go look up older interpretations of Nostradamus's predictions, the quatrains have been made to fit different historical events. The same quatrain has been made to fit different events in history because they can be interpreted differently. It's fascinating stuff, but not necessarily at all psychic or something we should be paying attention to. Plus the fact that he wrote it in 15th century French, and then there's a question of translation and updating that people may have done over the years. So it's unfortunate that, I know people put a lot of stock in his stuff, but it's no better than any prediction in general. And the way these things are written, if you really look at the quatrains, they can be made to fit a bunch of different things historically, and even today we can make some things fit for that matter. Psychic, one of the biggest problems, and I think you know this, Kathy, making predictions about the future, is that the future is often it's always in motion, as Yoda would say. What we have, and this is actually going back to the psychic dream question, there were a number of what people sent me, the descriptions of their dreams, where they paid attention to what their dreams said about the future and avoided things that actually did happen to other people or to, just look like they would have happened. We often call that the intervention paradox in parapsychology, where we're getting information seemingly from a future, but it's not necessarily the future, with the exception, I think, of The Simpsons. They may actually have something going there. Can't quite figure out how they have predicted things the way they have. But, here's an interesting thing. Back in the 2000s, DC Comics had businessman Lex Luthor elected president by people who didn't know anything about his background or didn't accept all the things that Superman and others were saying about Lex. And he turned out to be a terrible president. And all sorts of bad things happened. So anyway, is that predictive of what's happening today? Hard to say. All right. Tina, New York Nerds. How was Captain America? I've heard mixed things about it. I do want to see it, but I've heard some pretty negative things about it. It's not a great movie. I'll still see it anyway. I'll see what happens with it. Looking forward more to the Fantastic Four this summer. In the Dune universe, people started embracing psychic stuff to fight AI. Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. As long as we don't have Skynet developing, we might be okay. We talked a little bit about this yesterday at the Rhine session. Somebody did ask about AI and applied to parapsychology. And so I'll just mention this, that the company, my day job is working for a company that actually has an AI product for the legal world. And we also have access to a large language model internally as well. And I've been using something called you.com, you.com, which is it's been a great search engine, and I've had really good experience with it. Even when it was just a search engine, it was a much better search engine than Google, because it actually gave me the sources that it was pulling the information from, not just answering things. That's really something that's important for AI as well. So one of the things that I'm going to be trying to do, since we now have the ability to do that for my company, is uploading. I actually downloaded, since the company, the information service we have called LexisNexis has access to the Journal of Parapsychology in text format, not just as a PDF. I've downloaded almost 300 research articles for the last 20 years. And I'm going to upload those into our large language model and start asking questions and see what the AI will do in terms of finding commonalities for ESP, things like that. I see that as the future for a lot of scientific research, being able to upload large amounts of data into these large language models so that you can actually have it quickly and easily find answers to questions you have about the research and look for patterns, kind of like a huge meta-analysis. But more than that, what are the common factors that seem to be in the participants? What are the common factors in people's psychology? What are the common factors for when you ran the experiments, for all this stuff that might be helpful in us understanding how to really increase people's psychic abilities, and other things that might be telltale. I would love to have and I'm going to start downloading. I have a lot of the old literature from the Society for Psychical Research and the American Society from the early days, the very early days, that's all free on the Internet Archive. A bunch of books with people's experiences, including Phantasms of the Living and Human Personality and the Survival of Bodily Death, experiences with ghosts, experiences with the afterlife in general. And I want to load all that into a large language model, since I have a lot of that in text already. Again, let it consume this stuff and provide us with some patterns that we can then either adapt to other experiments today, or will help us learn more about the phenomenon. Louisa Rhine at the Rhine Center was more interested in people's everyday experiences with ESP and psychokinesis and apparitions and hauntings and all that stuff. And she spent time going through thousands of letters that people wrote in about their experiences, coming up with material for many books that she wrote. But an AI, a large language model, can do a much better job than a human being can, not just quickly, but actually identifying things that might have been missed by a human being. So it'd be great to upload all that stuff. I think that we might actually, and then maybe we have psychics come up with really good questions to ask the AI. I think that might, and mediums as well, once we have this data up there. I think it'd be kind of interesting to see what we get. Caitlin, here, there's way more air traffic, which makes accident. There's been way more air traffic for the last, 30 years, actually. I don't know that it hasn't suddenly increased any further. In fact, I know that during COVID, a lot of available flights and the flight routes changed and dropped. I mean, I'm here in California. I take Southwest when I can, and during the pandemic, they cut a lot of their flight routes, so I can't sometimes get directly to places that I wanted to without changing planes a couple times. That's happened with a lot of the airlines as well. So I don't know whether that's really true that there are more flights, which makes more accidents. The question is, how are the the air traffic controllers dealing with things, and are there issues with the technology that they're using as well? Captain America's flawed but likable, precursor to Thunderbolts. Yeah, I know that's coming out this summer too. Yeah, Marvel may be putting out way too much in too short a time, I think. But I've seen the trailer for the Fantastic Four, and that looks really great. It does look like a good movie, hopefully. Of course, I'm more interested and more excited about the Superman movie that's coming out in July, probably about a week and a half. I think it's 1 or 2 weeks before Fantastic Four comes out as well. All right. We have about 16 or 17 minutes left. I'm just going to make one more comment about The Simpsons. There are so many episodes of The Simpsons. Somebody needs to put the transcripts of those into an AI model and see what kind of predictions they can pull out of that. So we'll have to see. Have there ever been communications from parapsychologists who have moved on to the other side? On occasions, actually, probably the most famous one within our field is something called the cross correspondences, which happened in the early 20th century. Frederick Myers, who was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research, psychical researcher, therefore also a parapsychologist technically, after he passed, mediums started getting messages apparently from Myers. But here's the difference. Several mediums who were separated, this is back before it was easy to have even long distance communication. There was long distance phone calls, but not so much easy to communicate with people in the UK. And there were pieces, think of it as pieces of a puzzle, partial messages that were delivered to multiple mediums who were not in communication with each other, especially ones in a time fashion that could not have happened at the time. It couldn't have been collusion. That was looked at, where the messages fit together and related to Myers trying to get something across from his literary background as well as his background in psychical research. The cross correspondences are considered some of the best evidence for post-death communication, and it was a psychical researcher who was involved. I know that some mediums have gotten messages from people over the years. I don't believe anybody's gotten any messages from Scott Rogo or the Rhines at all. I don't know if they've kind of come through. Certainly people I've known who were in or around the field have come through, some mediums. My late investigations partner, Annette Martin, who was a psychic and medium, she came through a number of times through some of the Forever Family Foundation mediums and a couple of others as well. And then someone I work with extensively on psychokinesis and who was a mentor to me, Martin Caden, came through a medium by the name of Sandra O'Hara, who did unfortunately pass away a few years ago. But she was an amazing medium from Ireland who worked there. I don't know what the deal is with parapsychologists on the other side. They may be working a different way. There, of course, also is the Skoll experiment, which took place in the UK. The Skoll group has been active elsewhere as well, where they had deceased engineers and scientists bringing information through for them and creating activity. So if you look up Skoll, the Skoll group or Skoll experiment, you'll find that there are a couple of books on the subject. There is a documentary, a couple documentaries on it. So those are kind of good places to go there. All right. Germany already called it Sky. Did they call it Skynet? Oh my God. I hope that's like an ironic name. Skynet in the Terminator movies pretty much is self-aware AI, and we haven't had that yet, thankfully. Ian Stevenson said, a lot of folks have said they try to make contact after they died, but this goes back to one other individual who has probably had more attempts at communication with him than anybody else in history, and that is Harry Houdini. There have been on the anniversary of Houdini's death, which was actually October 31st, he died on Halloween. Magicians and psychics have done Houdini seances since a year after he died. Originally, there was an official one. It was only dealt with by Bess Houdini and a few others. Walter Gibson was involved in that. Then Gibson continued that after 10 years after Bess kind of closed the book on that. And there are sometimes on October 31st, dozens of magicians, and frankly, they're doing it for promo. They're not doing it to actually try to communicate with Houdini. But I've seen some situations where they're bringing in a psychic and they're trying to the magicians would love to hear from Houdini, but he hasn't come through. And of course, that's their evidence that life after death doesn't exist. That Houdini never, if anybody can come through, Houdini could. It's like, how do you know? Houdini could have been reincarnated. Houdini could be busy doing something else on the other side. He may not want to come through for whatever reason, because he was definitely a skeptic or debunker of mediums. And the other thing is that, there's so many seances going on a given Halloween that he may not know which one to go to. He may not want to decide. And thank you for the comment on my shirt. I appreciate that. Yeah, it is a space scene from the 1950s, kind of spaceships and stuff. All right. Bess is buried in, I assume that means Bess, Kathy, is buried in Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Valhalla. I'm trying to remember. Valhalla has a bunch of cemeteries, and my dad is buried in one of those. I don't remember the name of the cemetery, though, specifically. My dad and his parents are buried there in Valhalla as well. Okay, Houdini supposedly worked with Gary Schwartz in his experiments. Yeah, it'd be interesting if that's actually happening, Mariah. I've not seen anything about that. Of course, Gary is kind of hard to communicate with these days. He's always been trying to more communicate, I think, with people in the afterlife than people who are his colleagues. Yeah, Valhalla is a beautiful area. For those of you who don't know, it's a real town in Westchester County. There are a lot of cemeteries there. There's also Westchester Community College is there, one of the sites for that community college and high schools and things like that. So it's a nice town. It's not as cemetery bound as what we have here, Colma, here in the Bay Area, which is south of San Francisco. Their motto, and I won't have it exactly right, is Colma, the city where the dead outnumber the living. Very few people live in Colma, but there is a huge number of cemeteries that are there. Some really interesting monuments and other places. Also beautiful. Another beautiful cemetery I've been to was the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, the big one. The Dutch Church Cemetery, the original one where Ichabod and Katrina and Abraham or Brom are buried, the people who in the town who Washington Irving based the story on. That's right next to the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. But the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is beautiful to walk around. The Sawmill River goes through there. The actual bridge, the Headless Horseman supposedly went over, is there as well. And Washington Irving is buried in that particular cemetery. So, I've I don't typically go to cemeteries at all. I never really have to try to find ghosts because I don't know. I don't know about you, but if you were dead, would you want to hang around a cemetery? Unless there were a lot of ghosts partying or something like that. It's the last place you'd expect to find spirits in general. But many of them are landscaped so well and are really beautiful, and have some really interesting things to visit. Also, historically, the Salem Cemetery, Salem, Massachusetts, really interesting one as well. Okay. Any thoughts on people who are cryogenically frozen? You think their souls are in the afterlife? I guess it depends on whether they're considered the consciousness that is that person considers themselves deceased. That's something we really never looked at all, because people haven't been revived, so we don't know what happens after they come back at that point. At this point, technically, they're dead or in suspended animation. And does that mean that their consciousness is in suspended animation also? I don't really know what that would be like. Yes, you're right. Wyatt Earp is buried in Colma in the Jewish part of the cemetery, actually. There are a number of other historical people that are buried there. And I'll tell you a quick story, which is really synchronistic. A number of years ago, my friend John Hastings, who is a great comic book artist and artist in general, he's done my logos, for example. Didn't do the OPI logo, that comes pre-John, but did my Professor Paranormal logo and a couple other logos for me. John suggested we get a group of us and we drive down to Colma, and he was going to take us on a tour of some really cool monuments in the cemetery. And so we met up in Colma and we drove over to the cemetery, kind of on a line, and people are parking in different streets on different pathways there. So I pull over, and I don't know that anybody was within 100 yards of me, but we could see where everybody else was. And I open my car door, and there's not only the tombstones or monuments standing up, but there's also people buried where there's a stone on the ground. And my name, Lloyd, is spelled with one L. That is not as unusual today as it used to be. There was almost nobody you could find in the 50s and 60s with Lloyd with one L. And the idea of finding somebody like that, the odds were very, very slim. So I opened my door and I looked down, and there's a stone there, just off the road. And the person died in the late 1800s, and the name is Lloyd Hawk, and it's Lloyd with one L. That's directly opposite my car door. I mean, think about what the odds are for that. So we didn't have any ghosts. We did find the clown monument. It was a car crash of a circus train, and a number of clowns died, and so they built a monument there to them. Pretty interesting. Okay, Paul, thanks for saying that. Talk to other people who work in cemeteries. Any research on electromagnetic fields and ghost sightings? Sort of. We do know that apparitions from long-term looking at the experiences and research in the field, apparitions themselves are not electromagnetic in nature. There have been correlations between not apparitions or ghost conscious entities, but correlations, the majority of the correlations between electromagnetic field anomalies or changes and locations or parts of a location relate to residual hauntings. Some of us who were using EM field detectors in the 80s, we started doing it then. There have been others who were looking at them. We use them to check the environment. We do not use them to detect ghosts. We cannot say also that an anomaly in a household where people are having experiences with residual haunting, an imprint, whether that is absolutely paranormal or not, psychic or not. However, what's really interesting is that you can, and we've done this with permission of the families, turn the power off and see if that anomaly is still there. Because EM field meters mostly pick up the electromagnetic fields from electronics, technology, wiring, things like that. I found more bad wiring with an EMF meter than I've ever found something paranormal. So when you have these anomalous fields that are still registering, there is something going on, and more importantly, are they happening in the same spot that the residual haunting is replaying? And the answer to that has been there's been some correlation, quite a bit of correlation, not comprehensive, not every situation, but that's happened. With apparition cases, sometimes there's activity around where people say that the apparition is walking or moving. Sometimes. Sometimes through communication with a medium or a psychic, asking the apparition to play with the meter, we have some responses happening like that. Sometimes. But we had one case, one of the OPI folks and I had one case where the main reason we were called to this case is it was out in a rural area near Stockton. At one point, it had been a ranch. There was a ranch on the property that was just, that was taken out, and there was a house there. And we were called out because of a residual haunt piece that really, we had a problem with detecting anything electromagnetically because the spot was right around where the refrigerator was, and the people didn't want us to turn off the power to the refrigerator. And refrigerators give off a lot of EMF, so forget about that. But inside the house, they also talked about the fact that they had a woman dressed in like 1880s clothing who would occasionally walk through the house, react to them, walk over to their toddler, who was, I think, close to two years old. And they were fine with this woman's ghost because the toddler would laugh, and it was almost like she was entertaining, the ghost was entertaining the girl. So as we're sitting there, the couple says, oh, they see her because they actually saw her. And they pointed to where she was walking through the room. And Brian and I tried to get measurements exactly where she was. Nothing. But oddly enough, 3 feet behind her, we were getting kind of all sides, but not on the floor. It was kind of like midair. But again, 3 feet behind where they were pointing, we were getting some unusual readings, anomalous readings. That was moving. The thing was moving. Ended up by the little girl, and the little girl started reacting to something. So I did talk to a physicist who was a skeptic, not a true disbeliever, but a skeptic. And he felt that given what I was talking about, and given that there is electromagnetism in the world and around us, he felt that whatever the ghost was made of was not electromagnetic, because we were not picking anything up, but was interacting with the general electromagnetic field. So that's what we were picking up, kind of picking up the wake of an invisible boat, so to speak. So that's where we go with that. Last couple of minutes, we're down to the wire here, so let me see if I can hit these other two. Anyone told the current president that there are too many project organizations called Stargate? I don't know. The Stargate program actually came up with that name after others, including Grill Flame and Sunstreak and other black budget projects, had nothing to do with the movie. There's, people started picking up on that because of the movie, the word Stargate, not because of the Stargate program, which didn't get revealed until 1995. Tina, your grandparents are in coma as well. Do you think devices can be altered by emotions of the people? If you mean the living people are as likely, if not more likely, to affect devices, because we do have a lengthy amount, years worth of data that living people can affect computers and other devices. A lot of research in the laboratory, a lot of research on human-machine interaction. We see that living people absolutely can do this. So the question for us always is, if there's no other indication of a spirit being present affecting the devices, why do you think there's a spirit there? Based on this, how do you know it's not you or the investigators or something else affecting it? We always in our field look towards human experience as the primary bit of evidence. No human experience, that tech means nothing, because none of it is definitively able to detect ghosts. And on that note, I'm going to finish up here because we're going about a minute over. I want to thank everybody for joining for another kind of rousing discussion here. although it's kind of one-sided on my side, my part. Next time I'm back in 2 weeks on March 2nd. So it is going to be every 2 weeks until the end of May. And then we're going to shift a week because I'll be away. I'll miss one as it happens. But it is every 2 weeks. Please tell your friends, like and subscribe. Feel free to email if you go through back to the chat, the email's there. Feel free to send me a note. I may take a couple days to respond because I get a lot of emails these days. And I hope to see you all back here in 2 weeks. Oh, and by the way, feel free to send me your question in advance of the show, and I'll even start off with those from the emails. Take care, everybody. Have a great couple of weeks. Bye-bye.